The fever raged for 3 days and 3 nights, turning their small ranch house into a battlefield where hope and despair fought for dominance with every labored breath Molly took. Eliza had claimed the rocking chair beside the child's bed as her permanent post, leaving only when absolutely necessary, and always with reluctant steps that carried her no farther than the kitchen for fresh water or clean clothes. Jackson paced the house like a man possessed, bringing supplies and checking on his daughter with the helpless urgency of someone watching their world teeter on the edge of collapse. He had lost Sarah to fever and complications from childbirth, and the memories of those dark days haunted every moment of Molly's illness. The thought of losing his daughter too, losing both of the most precious people in his world, was almost more than his heart could bear. Clara had surprised them all by staying, rolling up her expensive sleeves and working alongside Eliza with a determination that spoke of hidden depths beneath her polished exterior. She helped prepare cooling baths, held Molly steady when the child thrashed with fever dreams, and never once complained about the demands being placed on her refined sensibilities. But it was clear to everyone, including Clara herself, that she was following Eliza's lead, taking direction from the woman who moved through the crisis with the sure instincts of someone who had learned to fight for what mattered most. "She knows things I don't," Clara admitted to Jackson during a brief moment when they both stood outside Molly's room, listening to Eliza sing softly to the fevered child. About herbs, about healing, about what a child needs when they're fighting for their life. "I can organize charity events and manage social calendars. But this is something else entirely." Jackson nodded, his eyes never leaving the doorway where he could see Eliza bent over his daughter, spooning medicine between Molly's cracked lips with infinite patience. "She saved Molly from a rattlesnake bite," he said quietly. "Nearly died from the venom herself. That's when I knew she'd do anything to protect what she loves." On the second night, when Molly's fever spiked so high that she began speaking to people who weren't there, Eliza made a decision that would have seemed like madness to anyone who didn't understand the depths of a mother's desperation. She climbed into the narrow bed beside the child, ignoring Jackson's protests about contagion and Clara's concerns about propriety, and wrapped Molly's burning body in her own arms. "Sometimes," she whispered to Jackson as he stood uncertainly beside the bed, "a child needs to feel that someone is willing to go into the darkness with them, that they're not fighting alone." For the rest of that night, Eliza held Molly against her chest, sharing her strength and her stubborn refusal to surrender. She sang every lullaby she could remember, told stories about brave little girls who overcame impossible odds, and whispered fierce promises about all the wonderful things they would do together when the fever finally broke. "You're going to learn to ride like the wind," she murmured into Molly's damp hair. "And we'll plant a garden twice as big as the one we have now, with flowers in every color you can imagine. And when you're old enough, I'll teach you to shoot straight and true, so you'll never have to be afraid of anything." Jackson sat in the chair Eliza had vacated, watching this scene with something that felt like reverence. Here was love in its purest form, not the careful, calculated affection that came from social compatibility, but the fierce, protective instinct that would sacrifice everything for the chance to save what mattered most. Clara stood in the doorway for a long time, studying the woman who had once been her rival and was now something she could never compete with, a true mother who loved without reservation or calculation. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and thoughtful. "I need to go back to town," she said. "This isn't my place." Jackson looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. "Clara, no," she said, holding up a hand to stop whatever explanation he might offer. "I can see what I should have seen from the beginning. You don't need someone who can navigate society parties and manage your social standing. You need someone who will fight death itself to protect your child." She paused at the threshold, looking back at the scene in the bed, Eliza holding Molly with the desperate tenderness of someone who refused to let go, whispering words of encouragement to a child who might or might not be able to hear them. "She loves you both, more than I ever could," Clara said quietly. "That terrifies you, doesn't it? Because it means you might have to risk your heart again." Then she was gone, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts and the sound of Eliza's voice promising Molly that dawn would come, that the fever would break, that love was stronger than any illness that dared threaten there. The fever broke just as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, as if Molly had been waiting for the light to show her the way back to them. Her eyes fluttered open, clear and bright for the first time in days, and she looked up at Eliza with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire room. "You stayed," she whispered, a voice hoarse but wonderfully, miraculously normal. "Always," Eliza whispered back, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks as she smoothed the child's damp curls. "I'll always stay with you, my darling girl, no matter what." Jackson moved to the bedside and gathered both of them into his arms, feeling as though he were holding his entire world in that embrace. The woman who had arrived in chains had become the anchor that held their family together, the fierce heart that beat at the center of everything that mattered. "Thank you," he whispered into Eliza's hair, and she knew he was thanking her for more than just nursing his daughter through the crisis. He was thanking her for choosing to stay, for fighting for them, for proving that love could triumph over fear and doubt and all the careful calculations that tried to keep hearts safe by keeping them distant. That afternoon, as Molly slept peacefully for the first time in days, Jackson found a letter waiting for him on the kitchen table, written in Clara's elegant script. "Jackson," it read, "I came here thinking I could reclaim something we lost years ago, but I can see now that some things aren't meant to be reclaimed. They're meant to be surpassed. Eliza is what I never could be for you, someone willing to risk everything for love. Don't let fear keep you from accepting the gift you've been given. She chose your family over her own safety and comfort. Now you have to choose her back. With all my hopes for your happiness, Clara." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, then went to find Eliza. She was in her garden, tending the lavender that had somehow survived the recent neglect, her movements gentle and sure as she worked the soil with her hands. "Clara's gone back to California," he said, settling beside her among the fragrant purple stalks. Eliza nodded, continuing her work. "She's a good woman. She could have made you happy in a different way." "Maybe," Jackson agreed, "but not in the way that matters most. Not in the way that makes me want to be better than I am, braver than I thought I could be." He reached for her dirt-stained hands, holding them in his own calloused fingers. "Eliza Cole, you came to us broken and afraid, and somehow you put all of us back together. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve what you've given us?" She looked at him with eyes that held all the love and wonder and stubborn hope that had carried her through the darkest times of her life. "Jackson Cole," she said, her voice steady as bedrock, "I would be honored to be your wife, to be Molly's mother, to be part of this family we've built together." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of promise, Jackson Cole kissed the woman who had transformed his house into a home and his grief into gratitude. Tomorrow there would be a wedding to plan and a future to build, but tonight there was just this, the perfect peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong, with exactly the people who matter most. Part 8. Home at last. The wedding took place on a crisp morning in early spring, when the desert was painted with wildflowers and the air carried the promise of new beginnings. They had planned something simple, just Pastor Williams from the church and a few close friends as witnesses, but somehow word had spread through Dry Creek, and half the town showed up to see Jackson Cole marry the woman who had won their respect through quiet acts of kindness and unwavering devotion to his daughter. Eliza wore a dress of cream-colored silk that widow Thompson had helped her sew, simple in design but elegant in its clean lines and careful stitching. Around her throat was the silver necklace that connected her past to her present, her grandmother's. Locket beside the wooden heart Molly had carved with such loving determination. Her dark hair was arranged in a simple chignon with a few wildflowers tucked behind one ear, and when she smiled, she looked like someone who had finally found her way home after a very long journey. Molly served as both flower girl and ring bearer, scattering lavender petals from her mama's garden while carrying the simple gold bands Jackson had ordered from the territorial capital. She wore a new dress of pale yellow cotton and an expression of such profound satisfaction that it made everyone who saw her smile in response. "Do you, Jackson Thomas Cole, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Pastor Williams asked, his voice carrying clearly across the small gathering. "I do," Jackson said, his eyes never leaving Eliza's face. "Before God and this community, I promise to love and protect her, to build a life worthy of the gift she's given us, and to honor the strength it took for her to choose us over the safety of running away." When it was Eliza's turn, her voice was clear and strong despite the tears that sparkled in her eyes. "I do," she said. "I promise to love this family with everything I have, to make this ranch a home filled with laughter and security, and to never forget that we chose each other not out of desperation, but out of hope." The celebration that followed was simple but joyful tables set up in the churchyard, food contributed by every family in town, and music provided by old Tom Henderson on his fiddle. Eliza found herself surrounded by women who had once crossed the street to avoid her, now offering advice about marriage and recipes for Jackson's favorite meals. She had earned her place in this community, not through social connections or inherited status, but through the patient work of proving that character mattered more than circumstance. "You've done something remarkable," Widow Thompson told her as they stood watching Molly dance with some of the other children. "You've taken a broken family and made it whole again. That's a gift not everyone possesses." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, the newlyweds made their way home with Molly chattering excitedly between them about the party and the dancing and the 3-tier cake that Mrs. Patterson had contributed to the celebration. The ranch looked different somehow, not just because of the flower garlands that still decorated the porch railing, but because it finally felt complete. This was no longer Jackson's ranch where Eliza happened to live. It was their home, built on foundations of mutual respect and shared dreams and the kind of love that grows stronger through adversity. That evening, after Molly had been tucked into bed with extra kisses and promises that yes, now they really were a family in every way that mattered, Jackson and Eliza sat together on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "Any regrets?" Jackson asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders as she leaned against him. "Only one," Eliza said, her voice soft with contentment. "I wish my parents could see this, could see that their daughter found her way to happiness after all. Maybe they can," Jackson suggested, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Maybe they're the reason that wagon stopped at just the right place, at just the right time, so Molly could see you and insist that we help." Eliza smiled at the thought, imagining her mother's gentle spirit guiding events toward this moment. This perfect peace that she had never dared to hope for during the darkest times of her captivity. "What happens now?" she asked, not with worry, but with the pleasant anticipation of someone who finally had a future worth planning for. "Now we build something that will last," Jackson said. "We raise Molly to be strong and kind and never doubt that she's loved. We make this ranch prosper not just for ourselves, but for the family she have someday. And we show this territory that love is stronger than prejudice, that people can change and grow and become more than what their worst moments made them." As if summoned by their conversation, Molly appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, rubbing sleepy eyes with the back of one small hand. "I heard talking," she said. "Are you planning things without me?" "Never," Eliza said, opening her arms to the child who ran to her with hash. "Daddy, is she dying?" She came in chains. But he gave her a dress, a name, and a second life. Part 1. The Girl in Chains. The Arizona sun hung low over Dry Creek like a brass coin melting in the sky, casting long shadows across the dust-caked town that seemed to shimmer in the heat. It was 1875, and the territory still felt wild, untamed, as if civilization were just a thin veneer over something much older and harder. The livestock market pulsed with noise shouts of traders, the thunder of hoofbeats, and the rustle of restless cattle shifting in their pens. The air hung thick with the stench of sweat, dung, and desperation. Jackson Cole, a broad-shouldered rancher of 36, led his daughter by the hand through the chaos. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much sorrow, yet his eyes softened whenever they looked down at the small girl beside him. Molly, just 4 years old, skipped beside him in a faded blue dress, her golden curls bouncing with every step like captured sunlight. "Daddy, can we see the ponies after?" she chirped, her voice bright as morning bird song. "We will, darling. Just need to check on the hay first," Jackson replied, though his mind was elsewhere, calculating costs and wondering how he'd stretch another $1 to make it through the coming winter. But before they reached the hay stalls, Molly stopped abruptly. Her small hand tightened around his calloused fingers like a vice. Jackson felt the change in her immediately, the way children do when something in their world shifts wrong. "What is it?" Jackson asked, crouching down to meet her eyes. Those bright blue pools that reminded him so much of his late wife, Sarah. Molly didn't speak. She just pointed with her free hand toward the far edge of the market, where shadows pooled thick and dark beneath a weathered overhang dot at first. Jackson couldn't make out what had caught her attention. Then his eyes adjusted, and his breath caught in his throat. There, nearly hidden in the shadow, a woman was chained to a thick wooden post like some forgotten piece of livestock. Iron shackles bound her wrists and ankles, the metal cutting cruel lines into her skin. She was barefoot, her dress little more than filthy rags hanging from her frame. Her face was a map of bruises, purple and yellow and sick green, with dried blood streaking down from a cut above her eye. Her dark hair hung like a curtain over her slumped shoulders, hiding whatever remained of her dignity. "Daddy," Molly's voice was smaller now, barely a whisper. "Is she dying?" Jackson's chest tightened as he watched the woman's barely perceptible breathing, the way her body sagged against the post, as if she were trying to disappear into the wood itself. People passed her without a glance, as if she were invisible, as if she were nothing at all. She wasn't part of the livestock auction. She wasn't even afforded the dignity of being called merchandise. She was just there, forgotten, waiting for whatever came next. A nearby trader, a thin man with yellowed teeth and clothes that reeked of whiskey, noticed Jackson staring. "She yours?" he asked, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "No," Jackson replied, his voice low and careful. "Whose is she?" The man shrugged with the indifference of someone who had long since stopped seeing people as anything more than problems to be solved or profits to be made. Was her brother's. He owed more than he could pay gambling debts, mostly. She's what's left of his collateral. Barely breathing, though. Ain't worth much in this condition. Jackson looked back at the woman, studying the slight rise and fall of her chest, the way her fingers hung limp in the shackles. Why hasn't anyone taken her? The trader let out a harsh laugh. Who'd want a half-dead girl with fire in her gut and nothing left to sell? She's been here 3 days. Figures she'd be dead by sundown. Save everyone the trouble. Jackson started to turn away. This wasn't his problem, wasn't his responsibility. He had his own troubles, his own mouth to feed, his own grief to carry. But Molly didn't move. Her small fingers tugged at his hand with surprising strength. "Daddy," she said, her voice carrying that particular quality children have when they see something adults have trained themselves to ignore. "She's hurt. We gotta help her." He looked down into his daughter's eyes, those clear blue pools that held a compassion he hadn't seen in years, a kind of innocent wisdom that cut through all his careful reasoning. The child had lost her mother just 2 years ago, had seen her own share of pain, yet here she stood, ready to extend a hand to a stranger's suffering. "Please," Molly whispered, and in that single word, Jackson heard an echo of his late wife's voice, felt the ghost of Sarah's gentle hand on his shoulder, urging him toward kindness even when kindness seemed foolish. He hesitated, running calculations in his head. He didn't have space for this, didn't have the time or resources. His ranch was barely breaking, even as it was. But then he looked again at the woman in chains, not at her bruises or her rags, but at her hands. Even in their bound state, he could see they were the hands of someone who had once worked, who had once cared for things. These weren't the hands of someone born to chains. How much? He heard himself ask. The trader blinked in surprise. "You serious? How much to unchain her and get her on a horse?" $5. The amount was nothing to the trader, but to Jackson, it represented feed for his livestock, or repairs to his fence, or any number of necessities that kept his small ranch running. Jackson reached into his coat and counted out the coins with steady fingers, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The trader pocketed the money faster than a striking snake and moved to unlock the shackles. The woman crumpled the moment the chains fell away, collapsing into Jackson's arms like a broken doll, her body fever-hot and far too light. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel how every bone seemed to push against her skin. Molly stood nearby, her small hands clenched at her sides, watching with the solemn intensity children reserve for moments they sense will change everything. "What's her name?" Jackson asked the trader as he lifted the unconscious woman. Didn't give her one. Didn't ask. Jackson carried her to his horse, settling her carefully in front of him before helping Molly onto her pony. As they rode out of Dry Creek, he could feel the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations following them. Just a man, a child, and a woman nobody had wanted riding toward whatever came next. The land stretched golden and endless before them, painted in shades of amber and rust by the setting sun. The woman hadn't stirred since they'd left town, her body sagging against Jackson's chest with complete unconsciousness. Her breathing was shallow, irregular, and Jackson found himself listening for each small exhale, afraid it might be her last. "Daddy," Molly called softly from her pony. "She's not moving again." Jackson looked down at the woman's face, pale as winter moonlight, her lips dry and cracked. But then Molly did something that made Jackson's throat tighten. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a frayed handkerchief one Sarah had embroidered with tiny flowers before she died. Without a word, Molly rose in her stirrups and gently wiped the woman's brow, brushing away the dried blood and dust with infinite care. "It's okay now," she whispered to the unconscious woman. "You're coming home with us." Jackson watched as his daughter smoothed the woman's tangled hair with tiny, careful fingers, and something that had been frozen in his chest for 2 long years began to crack open. The woman's body, though broken and bruised, seemed to lean into them both with unconscious trust, as if some part of her recognized safety even in her fevered state. He looked ahead toward his ranch, the reins firm in his hands, and behind the familiar ache in his ribs, something stirred, something he'd thought died with Sarah. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but it was life. Quiet and uncertain, but still breathing. Still possible. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jackson Cole rode home with a daughter who believed in mercy and a woman who had nowhere else to go. Whatever happened next would happen together, in the small space between survival and something that might someday become home. Part 2. the quiet healing. The room smelled of pine and old dust, with a faint undertone of the lavender soap Sarah had once favored. Eliza, though she didn't yet know that would be her name, opened her eyes slowly, lids heavy as stone. The low ceiling above her swam into focus. Rough wooden beams crossed with spider webs, and a single glass window cracked in one corner where thin sunlight seeped through like liquid gold. Her body ached from the inside out, every muscle screaming in protest as she tried to shift on the narrow cot. Her wrists burned where the shackles had cut deep, and her throat felt raw as desert sand. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest. Where was she? Who had brought her here? But then she heard something that made her freeze. The sound of small feet moving carefully across wooden floors. She turned her head just slightly, moving like a wounded animal afraid to draw attention to itself. In the doorway stood a little girl with golden curls, holding a wooden bowl with both hands. Steam curled from its surface, carrying the scent of oats and honey and something else, kindness, maybe, though she couldn't remember the last time she'd recognized that particular smell. "I brought you some porridge," the girl said, her voice small but sure, like someone far older than her years. "It's not too hot." I waited. Eliza didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Her eyes tracked the child like those of an injured fox, too weak to run, too weary to trust. The girl, Molly, though Eliza didn't know her name, yet stepped closer and set the bowl down on a makeshift knit stand with infinite care. "Papa says you've been sleeping for 2 days," Molly continued, settling cross-legged on the floor beside the cot. "I've been checking on you, making sure you're still breathing." Still, Eliza said nothing. She waited until the child left, her small footsteps fading down the hallway, before she dared reach for the bowl. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the spoon, and the first taste of warm food in days brought tears to her eyes that she quickly brushed away. Jackson had put her in the old storage room off the main house. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof, but it was cleaner now than it had been in years. He brought in the cot, a simple wooden chair, and a pitcher of fresh water. There was even a small mirror propped on a shelf, though Eliza couldn't yet bear to look into it. As the days passed, she moved through her recovery like a ghost learning to be solid again. She never spoke unless spoken to, and even then offered only a few clipped words in response. But Jackson noticed things. He noticed how she swept the front steps without being asked, how she mended a tear in Molly's dress with hands that remembered the art of making things whole. He noticed the way she read aloud from an old primer book by the fire in the evenings, her voice soft as wind through prairie grass, while Molly curled at her feet like a contented kitten. Missy, Molly had begun calling her, because Eliza felt too long and formal for a 4-year-old tongue. The woman didn't correct her. In truth, she couldn't remember the last time anyone had called her by any name at all. Jackson kept his distance, maintaining the careful boundaries of a man who had learned to guard his heart. He made sure she ate, made sure she had what she needed, but he told himself this was obligation, nothing more. Just a decent man doing what was right for someone who had nowhere else to go. Yet he found himself watching from the kitchen window as she hung laundry on the line, noting the precise way she folded each piece. He watched her cool Molly's soup before serving it, watched her place a gentle hand on his daughter's head when the child fell asleep on the porch swing. She was still a stranger, but she moved like someone who had once belonged somewhere, someone who understood the rhythms of a home, the small rituals that made a house more than just a sheltered dot. It was early evening when everything changed. Jackson was repairing a fence near the back pasture, his hammer ringing against nails in a steady rhythm. Molly was chasing butterflies by the creek, her laughter bright as silver bells. Eliza had been gathering herbs not far off, moving slowly but steadily, rebuilding her strength one careful step at a time. Then came the scream. "Daddy!" Jackson dropped his hammer and ran, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw it before he reached them, a diamondback rattlesnake, thick as his forearm, coiled and ready to strike. But Eliza was faster. Without hesitation, without thought for her own safety, she hurled herself between the snake and the child, grabbing the serpent with her bare hands even as its fangs sank deep into her forearm. She didn't cry out, didn't scream. She only gritted her teeth and flung the snake into the brush, then sank to her knees, cradling her wounded arm against her chest. Jackson scooped Molly into one arm and pulled Eliza up with the other. The bite was ugly, already swelling, the puncture wounds dark and angry. He'd seen snake bites before, knew how quickly the venom could spread, how it could kill if not treated immediately. He worked through the night, crushing herbs, mixing poultices, binding her arm tight to slow the spread of poison. He laid cool claws across her forehead and whispered things he didn't know he still remembered. Prayers half forgotten from childhood, old songs his mother had sung, comfort words that seemed to rise from some deep well of memory. Eliza drifted in and out of consciousness, her body burning with fever. At some point near dawn, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open, wild and feverish. "Please," she murmured, her voice cracked and desperate. "Please don't chain me again." Jackson froze. He had heard her voice before, but not like this, not stripped of all defenses, raw with old terror. He reached for her hand, finding it cold and damp with sweat. "No one's chaining you," he said quietly, his voice steady as bedrock. "Not ever again." She didn't answer, her eyes slipping closed once more. But Jackson didn't leave. He sat beside her cot as dawn broke over the desert hills, holding the hand of a woman who had no reason left to trust, but had saved his daughter all the same. When Molly crept in with her morning blanket, she found her father still there, keeping vigil over the woman who had become something more than a stranger, though neither Jackson nor Eliza was ready yet to name what that something might be. The fever broke on the third day, leaving Eliza weak but alive. As she looked up at Jackson's tired face, something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words. She had saved his daughter. He had saved her life. They were no longer strangers bound by obligation, but something newer and more fragile. Two people learning to trust again, one careful breath at a time. Part 3. The weight of whispers by. The time the swelling in Eliza's arm had faded and color returned to her cheeks. Autumn had painted the desert hills in shades of gold and rust. The mornings carried a crisp edge that spoke of winter coming, and the days grew shorter, as if the sun itself were drawing inward. Life on the ranch had found its rhythm, Jackson tending the livestock, Molly chattering through her daily adventures, and Eliza moving quietly through tasks that needed doing. But as her strength returned, so did her restlessness. She stood in the small room that had become her sanctuary, packing the few items she possessed into a worn canvas bag. Her movements were deliberate, final. "I can't stay," she said when Jackson appeared in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He leaned against the door jamb, arms folded across his chest, studying her with those steady gray eyes that missed nothing. "You don't owe us anything," he said simply. But even as he spoke the words, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small cloth pouch. The coins inside clinked softly as he held it out to her. "There's enough here to get you as far as Santa Fe, if you travel light." Eliza took the pouch, her fingers trembling slightly as she tested its weight. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in months. More than anyone had given her in longer than she could remember. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt inadequate. From somewhere in the house came the sound of running feet, and suddenly Molly burst into the room, her face streaked with tears. She must have been listening from the hallway, absorbing the adult conversation with the keen intuition children possess. "You can't go," she cried, rushing to Eliza and clutching at her worn skirt with desperate fingers. "You saved me. You live here now." Eliza knelt down, bringing herself to the child's eye level. She smoothed Molly's golden curls with gentle hands, the same hands that had pulled a rattlesnake away from this precious girl. "You're safe now, little one," she said softly. "That's what matters." But Molly sobbed harder, burying her face against Eliza's shoulder. "I don't want you to go. Please don't leave me." Jackson watched this scene unfold, his jaw clenched tight. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke the words that would change everything. "You could stay on as help," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Paid work, I mean. Molly clearly likes you, and the place could use another hand." Eliza looked up at him, searching his face for something she couldn't name. "I'll earn my keep," she said with a soft nod. And so it was decided. Eliza Cole, though she had not yet taken the name that would become hers, would stay Dodd at first. The townspeople of Dry Creek watched and whispered. The settlement was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and Jackson Cole's business had become particularly interesting. The quiet widower, known for keeping to himself since his wife Sarah's death, was now seen riding with a dark-haired woman who had once hung in chains at the livestock market. The whispers followed Eliza wherever she went. At the general store, conversations died when she approached, only to resume in hushed tones after she passed. Women crossed the street rather than share the same wooden walkway. Men stared with a mixture of curiosity and something darker. "Charity case," someone muttered as she selected flour and beans at Turner's general store. "Heard she was bought. Just not for working," another voice added with a sneer. One afternoon, as Eliza waited to pay for supplies, an older woman with steel-gray hair and thin lips leaned close enough for her words to cut deep. "That's the woman he's keeping out at his place," she said, loud enough for half the store to hear. "Living in sin under the same roof as that innocent child." Eliza didn't flinch. She met the woman's cold gaze directly, paid for her goods with quiet dignity, and walked out with her head high. But the words followed her home, burrowing under her skin like thorns dotted the ranch. She threw herself into work with fierce determination. She woke before dawn to gather eggs and feed the horses. She scrubbed the porch until the boards gleamed, repaired loose hinges on the stable doors, and mended fence posts with hands that knew hard labor intimately. By the third week, the ranch looked more alive than it had since Sarah's passing. Every surface cleaned and tended with care. Molly followed her everywhere, chattering about everything and nothing, helping where her small hands could manage. "Miss E, can I help?" became her constant refrain as she trailed behind with baskets and tools too big for her to carry properly. One morning, as Eliza taught her how to plant winter herbs in the side garden, Molly looked up from the dark soil and made an observation, with the startling clarity children sometimes possess. "I think you're my new mama now," she said, as simply as commenting on the weather. The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. Her hands stilled in the earth, dirt caking under her fingernails. Jackson, who had just stepped outside with his morning coffee, froze on the porch steps. The coffee grew cold in his hands as he watched his daughter and the woman who had somehow become essential to their daily lives. He didn't say anything, couldn't find words for the complicated tangle of emotions the child's declaration had stirred up. Instead, he turned and walked back into the house, leaving Eliza alone with the weight of Molly's innocent hope. "Let's finish planting," Eliza whispered, blinking against the sudden sting in her eyes. A few days later, when Jackson asked her to accompany them to the schoolhouse to register Molly for the winter term, Eliza agreed without hesitation. They arrived just as the sun broke through the autumn clouds, painting the small wooden building in shades of gold. The teacher, a prim woman named Miss Hartwell, handed over the registration form and asked for Molly's details. Jackson was busy discussing school hours and supplies, so Eliza found herself holding the pen, filling in the careful lines. Name: Molly Cole. Age: 4 years. Address: Cole Ranch, Dry Creek, guardian, Jackson Cole, mother, Eliza Cole. Her hand trembled as she wrote those last two words, but she didn't cross them out. For just a moment, seeing it there in black ink, she allowed herself to imagine what it might mean to truly belong to this family that had grown around her like water finding its level. That evening, Jackson returned from town carrying a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He found Eliza in the kitchen, cleaning up after supper, her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back in a simple bun. "This came for you," he said, setting the package on the wooden table. She eyed it warily, then carefully untied the string. Inside was a dress, not fancy, but new and clean. It was made of pale blue cotton, the color of sky just before the stars emerged. Beneath the dress lay a small wooden name tag on a leather cord, carved with careful precision. Miss Eliza. Eliza stared at the simple gift, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. "Molly picked the color," Jackson said, not quite meeting her eyes. Said it looked like hope. That night, alone in her small room, Eliza held the blue dress up to the cracked mirror and saw something she hadn't seen in years. A woman with a name, with a place, with people who cared whether she stayed or went. The reflection looking back at her no longer seemed like a stranger. For the first time since chains had bound her wrists, Eliza allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was home. Part 4. Buried Truths. The morning fog rolled low across the valley, wrapping the ranch in silver mist that softened every edge and made the world seem like something from a dream. Dew clung to the fence posts and window ledges, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter coming down from the mountains. Eliza stood on the porch in her new blue dress, arms folded against the chill, watching the sun struggle to burn through the haze. She had risen before the others, restless with thoughts she couldn't name. Something about the stillness of the morning pulled at her, drew her toward the old storage shed where she'd first awakened in this new life. It had become a place for tools and forgotten things, but today it called to her like an old memory demanding attention. As she swept the far corner where cobwebs gathered thick as lace, her broom caught against a warped floorboard. The wood lifted slightly, revealing a gap that shouldn't have been there. Curiosity overcoming caution, she knelt and pried the board loose with her fingers. Hidden beneath, wrapped in layers of oilcloth that crackled with age, lay a bundle that smelled of dust and time and secrets. With trembling hands, she unwrapped it carefully. Inside were papers yellowed with age letters written in fading ink, an official-looking document with an elaborate seal, and a hand-drawn map etched in lines so faint she had to squint to make them out. The document bore an official seal, Crane Homestead, established 1861. Eliza stared at the name, her breath catching in her chest. Crane, her father's name. Her name, before the world had stripped it away and left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and chains. Around her wrists, the memories came flooding back like a dam bursting memories. She had buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself they were just fevered dreams. She was 7 years old again, watching her father, Thomas Crane, mark boundary stones with his own hands. Her mother, Catherine, humming while she tended their small garden, the scent of lavender and sage filling the morning air. Her brother Simon, 5 years older and full of grand plans for the future they would build together. On their own land. Then came the night that changed everything. Raiders had swept down from the hills like wolves, guns blazing and torches burning. Her mother's scream still echoed in the deepest corners of Eliza's memory. She and Simon had hidden in the root cellar while their world burned above them, and when they emerged at dawn, there was nothing left but ash and silence. The land had been claimed by others while the bodies were still warm. Officials with papers and badges had declared the Crane homestead abandoned, available for purchase by anyone with ready cash and no inconvenient questions about previous owners. Eliza and Simon had become orphans overnight, Their inheritance reduced to the clothes on their backs and the bitter knowledge that justice was a luxury they could no longer afford. By afternoon, the fog had lifted, and Eliza stood behind the barn with a spade in her hands. The earth was hard-packed from years of drought, but she worked methodically, remembering her father's words about the cedar box he'd buried near the old oak stump. Our legacy, he had called it. Something they can never take from us. Molly found her there, drawn by the sound of digging. "Can I help, Missy?" she asked, settling beside Eliza with the unconscious trust of a child who had never known betrayal. Together, they worked in the warming sun until the spade struck something solid. Eliza's heart hammered as she brushed away the dirt, revealing the corner of a wooden box, weathered but intact. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, she found treasures she thought lost forever. A silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother, a photograph of her family taken the summer before everything fell apart, and documents proving the Crane family's rightful claim to this land. "What's all this?" Jackson's voice cut through her reverie. She looked up to find him standing at the edge of the excavation, his face set in hard lines she had never seen before. "This land," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It used to be ours. This was my father's ranch." Jackson's expression darkened. "You've been digging behind my barn without a word to me? What was I supposed to think?" The accusation hit her like a slap. That I was stealing? Her voice cracked with old pain. That I was planning to run again? His silence was answer enough. She could see it in his eyes, the doubt, the careful distance he had maintained, even as she had poured her heart into making this place a home. After everything they had shared, after the snakebite and the quiet evenings and Molly's innocent trust, he still saw her as the woman in chains, someone whose word could not be trusted. "You still don't believe I belong here," she said, tears hot on her cheeks. Jackson stepped forward, trying to find the right words, but Eliza shook her head fiercely. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "You think I was born with chains around my wrists. But I wasn't. My father was a homesteader who built this place with his own hands. My mother sang in the church choir. I had a name and a family and a future, until men with guns decided we didn't matter enough to live. Then why didn't you tell me any of this?" Jackson asked, his own voice strained. "Because it didn't matter," she whispered, looking down at the photograph in her hands, three faces smiling back at her, from a time when the world had seemed full of possibility. Not when I was bleeding in chains at the livestock market. Not when I was sold like cattle to pay another man's debts. No one wanted to hear the story. They just wanted me to disappear quietly. Molly looked between the two adults, sensing the deep currents of pain that ran beneath their words. She reached for the photograph with careful fingers, studying the faces there. "This is your family, Missy?" she asked softly. Eliza nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. "My parents and my brother Simon, before everything changed." "What happened to your brother?" Molly asked with the directness children bring to difficult questions. Eliza's face crumpled. "Simon was all I had left after the fire. But he had debts. Gambling debts. When the men came to collect, he told them I was worth more than money." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He sold me to pay what he owed. Told me I'd be better off in chains than dead in a ditch." Maybe he was right. Jackson knelt beside her in the dirt, picking up the silver locket she had dropped. He rubbed the tarnished metal with his thumb, seeing not the woman who had arrived at his ranch broken and afraid, but the girl who had once worn this necklace to church on Sundays, who had helped her mother tend the garden, who had believed the world was a place where good things could last. "He was wrong," Jackson said quietly, his voice steady with conviction. "About all of it." He fastened the chain around her neck, the locket coming to rest just above her heart. "You're not what happened to you, Eliza. You're who you choose to be right here, with us." She looked up at him through her tears, and for the first time since she was 7 years old, She allowed herself to believe that maybe the past didn't have to define her future. The earth beneath her hands held the bones of her family's dreams, but it also held the promise of new growth, new life, new possibilities that could bloom from old sorrows died as the sun set behind the hills they had once called home. Eliza Cole closed her eyes and felt, for the first time in years, that she might not be lost anymore. Part 5. Seeds of Tomorrow. Wind carried the scent of dry earth and distant rain as Eliza stood before the patch of ground behind the barn. It was hard-packed and weed-choked, scarred by years of neglect, but to her eyes, it looked like possibility. She gripped the worn handle of Jackson's spade, dirt already caking under her fingernails, and knew this was about more than planting. This was about staying. Pick something that'll hold, Jackson had said that morning, handing her the tools with calloused hands that spoke of their own relationship with the soil. Something you believe in. She thought of her mother, humming old hymns while tending their garden back when the world was young and safe. Catherine Crane had grown herbs that could heal a fever and flowers that made their small cabin smell like heaven. Eliza closed her eyes and could almost hear that gentle voice. Plant what feeds the soul, not just the body. I want lavender, she told Jackson, and something in her voice made him look at her differently, not like the broken woman he'd carried home in chains, but like someone making a choice about the future. Lavender it is, he said simply. The work was harder than she remembered from childhood. The Arizona soil was different from the rich earth of her parents' farm dryer, more stubborn, full of rocks that cut her hands and roots that refused to budge. But each morning, Eliza rose with the sun and bent her back to the land, mixing compost with ash, hauling water from the well in heavy buckets that left her shoulders aching. Molly helped where she could, her small hands scattering seeds with the serious concentration of a child given important work. Will they know we love them? She asked one morning, kneeling beside Eliza in the rich, dark soil. I think they already do, Eliza whispered, brushing a golden curl from the little girl's cheek. The lavender came up cautious at first, thin green shoots that looked fragile, enough to break in a strong wind. But they grew stronger with each passing day, and Eliza found herself checking on them like a mother tending sick children, watering them with careful hands and whispering encouragement to the emerging plants. Meanwhile, the town of Dry Creek continued to watch and whisper. The gossip followed her like smoke wherever she went into Turner's General Store, past the church steps, through the dusty streets where decent women crossed to the other side rather than share her path. Some mornings, she found mean-spirited notes tucked under rocks near her garden, calling her names that cut deeper than any physical wound. But Eliza had learned something about endurance during her years of hardship. She kept walking with steady steps, not with her head held defiantly high, but with the quiet dignity of someone who knew her own worth. She brought small bundles of lavender to town when it bloomed, leaving them on doorsteps like gifts wrapped in hope. Molly helped with the deliveries, skipping from house to house with the joy of someone spreading secrets wrapped in purple ribbon. For Miss E, she would announce with a grin that could melt the hardest heart. One crisp morning, Widow Thompson, the preacher's widow and owner of the sharpest tongue in Dry Creek, stepped onto her porch holding the lavender sprigs Eliza had left the night before. She studied the fragrant bundle with eyes that had seen 7 decades of human folly, then looked up to find Eliza walking past with her marketing basket. You, she called out in her gravelly voice. Come here. Eliza approached cautiously, expecting another lecture about proper behavior and knowing one's place. You cook, don't you? Widow Thompson asked without preamble. Yes, ma'am. Good. Come by Thursday evening. We need an extra hand for the church supper. She paused, her weathered face softening just a fraction. I hate baking, and you seem to have gentle hands. Then she turned and went back inside, leaving Eliza standing on the porch steps, holding an invitation that felt like the first real door opening in years. Thursday evening arrived with the scent of cornbread and apple pies filling the church kitchen. Eliza stood at the wooden counter, flour dusting her apron, her hands moving with the remembered rhythm of feeding people who mattered. She found herself laughing an unguarded, surprised sound when Widow Thompson declared her biscuits passable, which is more than most can manage. Other women drifted into the kitchen throughout the evening, drawn by curiosity and the universal language of shared work. They asked careful questions about her herb garden, complimented her way with pastry, and slowly began to see her as something more than the subject of their gossip. She was someone who could make bread rise properly and knew which herbs eased a colicky baby's crying. That night, walking home under a canopy of stars, Jackson fell into step beside her. He didn't say much, that wasn't his way, but Eliza caught him watching her with something new in his expression. A kind of wonder, as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as the broken woman he'd rescued, but as someone who belonged to this place and was making it belong to her in return. "The lavender's taking hold," he said quietly. "It is," she agreed, touching the silver locket at her throat. "My mother always said lavender was stubborn. It'll grow almost anywhere if you give it time, like some people," Jackson said. And there was warmth in his voice that made something flutter in Eliza's chest. When harvest festival season arrived, it came with fiddles and lanterns, hay bales arranged for seating, and the kind of community celebration that made even the most reserved neighbors feel like family. Eliza wore her blue dress and helped organize the food tables, her lavender sachets tucked into baskets alongside apple, butter, and cornbread. She was arranging wildflowers near the makeshift stage when Molly appeared at her elbow, vibrating with excitement. "Missy, we're up next." "Next for what?" Eliza asked, though her stomach was already dropping with suspicion. "I told Miss Lacey we'd sing. Remember that song you taught me? The one Mama Catherine used to sing?" Before Eliza could protest, Molly was tugging her toward the stage where other families had shared songs and stories. The crowd hushed as they climbed the wooden steps, every eye fixed on the woman who had once been the subject of their whispered speculation and the child who had claimed her as family. "This is my mama's favorite song," Molly announced with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. The words hung in the evening air like a benediction. Eliza felt the weight of every gaze, the pressure of expectations she couldn't name. Her hands trembled, and for a moment she considered fleeing. Then Molly began to sing. It was an old hymn, one Catherine Crane had hummed while hanging laundry and mixing bread dough. The melody rose sweet and clear from Molly's young voice, and almost without thinking, Eliza joined in. Her voice was rusty at first, uncertain, but it grew stronger with each note until it soared above the gathering like something with wings. She didn't notice Jackson moving through the crowd until he was standing at the foot of the stage. He didn't smile. That wasn't his nature, but he climbed the steps with deliberate purpose, reached for her free hand, and held it before a town. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers with the strength of a promise, and in that single gesture, Eliza felt the last walls around her heart begin to crumble. The song ended to applause that felt like acceptance, like coming home after a long journey through country that had tried to break her spirit. As they walked down from the stage, still hand in hand, Eliza realized something had shifted. She was no longer the woman Jackson Cole had bought in chains. She was Eliza Cole, who grew lavender and sang hymns and belonged to this place as surely as it was beginning to belong to her. That night, as they tucked Molly into bed, the little girl looked up at them both with eyes that held all the wisdom children sometimes possess. "We're a real family now, aren't we?" she said simply. Eliza met Jackson's gaze over the child's golden head, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, she knew that whatever came after this moment, she would face it not as someone running from the past, but as someone who had finally found her way home. The sun was barely cresting the ridge when the elegant carriage rolled into the ranch yard, its polished brass fittings catching the early light like scattered coins. Dust curled behind the wheels in golden plumes, and the two bay horses that pulled it bore silver-stamped bridles that spoke of money and refinement. Eliza, hanging laundry on the line behind the house, heard the approaching wheels and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Jackson stood near the horse corral, his hand stilling on the fence post he'd been repairing. He squinted toward the approaching carriage, and Eliza saw his shoulders tense in a way that suggested this visitor was not unexpected, merely unwelcome. A woman stepped down from the carriage with practiced grace, her gloved hand extended before her boot touched the ground. Everything about her spoke of city life and careful cultivation. Her cream-colored silk dress that had never seen honest work, her hat adorned with a feather that curved just so over her perfectly arranged auburn hair. She looked like she had stepped from the pages of a ladies' magazine, all polish and poise and expensive perfection. "Jackson," she called, her voice carrying the warm honey tones of someone accustomed to being listened to. "It has been far too long." Eliza watched from the clothesline as Jackson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Clara," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. Clara Whitmore had once been Clara Morrison, Jackson's fiancée in the time before grief and responsibility had reshaped his life. She had fled west when their engagement ended, following promises of adventure and a wealthy older husband who had recently left her a widow with extensive holdings in California. Now she stood in Jackson's yard like a ghost of possibilities that might have been, beautiful and self-assured and everything Eliza knew she could never become. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Clara continued, though her tone suggested she had never doubted her welcome anywhere. "I was passing through on business and simply had to see how you were managing. And this must be dear little Molly." The child had appeared on the porch, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices and the sight of the finest carriage she had ever seen. Clara knelt gracefully, bringing herself to Molly's eye level with the practiced ease of someone who understood the power of charming children. "My goodness, you've grown into such a beautiful young lady," Clara said, her smile warm and genuine. "I knew you when you were just a baby, though you won't remember. I brought you something special from San Francisco." From her velvet reticule, she produced a small music box painted with dancing figures. When she wound the key, it played a delicate waltz that made Molly gasp with delight. Eliza felt her own heart contract as she watched the little girl's eyes light up with wonder. Jackson invited Clara to stay for dinner. How could he do otherwise without appearing churlish? And Eliza found herself serving stew to the woman who represented everything she had never been and could never become. Clara settled into the chair beside Jackson as if she belonged there, her conversation filled with stories of grand cities and cultured society, of opera houses and fine restaurants and the kind of life that existed in a world far removed from Arizona ranchland. "I brought you something as well," Clara said to Jackson over dessert, opening a small velvet pouch. "Salted caramels from that little shop in New Orleans we always talked about visiting. Do you remember?" Jackson's face remained impassive, but Eliza saw something flicker in his eyes' memory, perhaps, or regret for roads not taken. Molly squealed with delight over the exotic candy, and Clara laughed with genuine pleasure at the child's enthusiasm. Eliza retreated to the kitchen, telling herself she was just clearing dishes. But really, she needed distance from the easy intimacy between Jackson and this woman who clearly understood him in ways that came from years of shared history. She scrubbed plates with more force than necessary, her hands working while her mind churned through possibilities she didn't want to consider. The days that followed brought a subtle shift in the rhythm of their lives. Clara had taken rooms in town, but spent most of her waking hours at the ranch, full of plans and proposals that made Jackson's eyes brighten with something Eliza hadn't seen before. Ambition, maybe. or hope for a future that stretched beyond mere survival. We could build something extraordinary here, Clara said one morning over coffee, her manicured hands gesturing toward the pastures where Jackson's modest herd grazed. A breeding program for thoroughbreds. I have connections in California who would pay premium prices for quality stock. We could expand the house, bring in proper help, create something that would make this ranch the finest in the territory. Her gaze drifted almost casually to where Eliza knelt by the hearth, banking the morning fire. The look lasted only a moment, but it contained volumes an assessment, a dismissal, a clear understanding of where each woman stood in the hierarchy of Jackson's world. Eliza tried to ignore the changes, but they seeped into everything like water finding cracks in stone. Jackson spoke less at supper, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. He spent long hours writing the boundaries with Clara, discussing improvements and possibilities, while Eliza maintained the house and tended her garden with hands that felt increasingly uncertain. Even Molly seemed affected by the visitor's presence. One evening, as Eliza tucked her into bed, the child asked with the devastating directness children possessed, "If Miss Clara becomes my new mama, do I still get to call you Mama Eliza?" The question struck deeper than any physical blow could have. Eliza kissed the little girl's forehead and whispered, "You can call me whatever feels right in your heart, sweetheart." But sleep eluded her that night, and many nights after. The confrontation, when it came, happened in the garden where Eliza's lavender grew in neat, fragrant rows. She was weeding between the plants when Clara appeared, moving with the careful grace of someone unused to uneven ground. "You wanted to speak with me?" Clara asked, though she had been the one to approach. "I wanted to thank you," Eliza said, continuing her work without looking up. "Thank me? For what?" "For reminding me that some battles can't be won, no matter how hard you fight." Clara's smile was thin as paper. "I don't understand." Eliza straightened, meeting the other woman's gaze directly. "You don't have to understand. But I know what I look like to people like you, a woman with a past and no pedigree, someone who doesn't belong in respectable society. But I've earned every breath I take here. Can you say the same?" For the first time since her arrival, Clara's composure cracked slightly. "Eliza," she said, her voice dropping to something like kindness, "you can win over this ranch, perhaps. Maybe even the child. But society has a long memory. There will always be whispers, always be questions about where you came from and what you were before Jackson found you. Is that the life you want for him? For Molly?" The words found their mark, because they contained just enough truth to cut deep. Eliza nodded once, slowly, and turned back to her weeding. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eliza stood on the porch with her canvas bag packed and waiting. She hadn't told Jackson of her decision, couldn't bear to see relief or regret in his eyes. Clara could give him respectability, social standing, a future that reached beyond the hard scrabble existence of frontier life. What could she offer except complications and whispered scandals that would follow them for the rest of their days? Jackson found her there as the first stars appeared, his face unreadable in the growing darkness. "You're leaving?" he asked. "I can't compete with memories dressed in silk," she said simply. "And maybe that's why I should go." She waited for him to argue, to say something that would change the equation between them. But silence stretched like a chasm, filled only with the sound of night insects and distant cattle lowing in the pastures. Finally, she picked up her bag and stepped toward the porch steps. But before she could take another step, a child's voice called out from somewhere in the darkness. Missy, where are you?" It was Molly, and there was something desperately wrong with her voice, a raw, panicked cry that cut through the night like a knife. Both adults ran toward the sound, Jackson's boots pounding against the wooden porch boards, Eliza's skirts catching at her legs as she stumbled in the darkness. They found her collapsed beside the barn door, her small body convulsing with chills despite the warmth of the evening. Her face was flushed crimson with fever, her golden curls plastered to her forehead with sweat, and when Jackson lifted her, she felt impossibly light in his arms, as if the illness was already consuming her from within. "She's burning up," he said, his voice tight with the kind of fear every parent knows, the terror of helplessness in the face of a child's suffering. Eliza dropped her travel bag without a second thought and ran her hands over Molly's fevered skin, feeling for the telltale signs she had learned to recognize during her own difficult years. The child's breathing was shallow and rapid, her pulse fluttering like a trapped bird beneath Eliza's fingers. "Get her inside," Eliza commanded, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "We need to bring this fever down before it gets worse." As Jackson carried Molly toward the house, Eliza caught sight of Clara standing in the doorway, her face pale and uncertain in the lamplight. For a moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding that this was not the time for rivalry or wounded pride. This was about saving a child's life. "What can I do?" Clara asked quietly. "Boil water," Eliza said, already moving toward the kitchen. "And find every clean cloth in the house. We're going to need them." The next hours blurred together in a desperate dance of cooling claws and herbal remedies, of prayers whispered over a fevered child, and the kind of vigil that transformed strangers into family. Clara proved herself useful in ways that surprised them all, following Eliza's instructions without question, holding Molly steady while medicine was spooned between her lips, and never once complaining about the close air of the sick room or the demands being placed on her refined sensibilities. But it was Eliza who never left Molly's side, who sang lullabies in a voice hoarse from hours of constant use, who held the child's hand through every tremor and whispered reassurances that neither of them was certain she could keep. "Don't leave me, Mama Eliza," Molly mumbled during one of her brief moments of semi-consciousness, her small fingers clutching at Eliza's sleeve with desperate strength. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart," Eliza whispered back, her own tears falling silently onto the child's fevered brow. "I'll never leave you. I promise." Jackson stood in the doorway, watching this scene unfold, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what it meant to belong to someone. This wasn't duty or obligation, or even the kind of practiced care that came from social expectation. This was love in its purest form, fierce, protective, and absolutely unshakable. And in that moment, he knew with crystal clarity that Clara, for all her grace and social standing, could never be what his family needed. She could never love them with the desperate intensity of someone who had nearly lost everything and refused to let go again. Part 7. The fever breaks. The next 3 days blurred together like a fever dream of sleepless vigils and desperate prayers. Molly lay in her small bed, alternating between burning heat that soaked her nightgown with sweat and bone-deep chills that made her tiny body shake like a leaf in winter wind. Eliza never left her side, cooling the child's fevered brow with damp claws, coaxing spoonfuls of willow bark tea between cracked lips, and singing every lullaby she could remember from her own childhood. Jackson paced the house like a caged wolf, bringing fresh water and clean linens, but mostly just watching helplessly as the two most important people in his world fought a battle he couldn't join. Clara had retreated to town after the first night, claiming the sickroom air was too close, but her absence felt more like relief than abandonment to everyone involved. "Is she going to die?" Molly whispered during a brief moment of clarity on the second night, her blue eyes huge in her pale face. "No, sweetheart," Eliza said, smoothing the child's damp curls with infinite tenderness. "I won't let that happen. You just rest and let the medicine work." But privately, she wasn't certain. The fever was stubborn, resistant to all the remedies she knew. Molly's breathing grew more labored with each passing hour, and there were moments when Eliza had to lean close just to make sure the child was still drawing breath. On the third night, exhaustion finally claimed her. Eliza fell asleep in the rocking chair beside Molly's bed, her hands still clasping the little girl's fevered fingers, her head tilted forward at an uncomfortable angle that would leave her neck aching for days. It was nearly dawn when Jackson appeared in the doorway, drawn by some instinct he couldn't name. The scene before him stopped him cold. Eliza sat slumped in the chair, her hair escaping its pins in soft tendrils around her face, a dress wrinkled from 3 days of constant wear. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her face bore the drawn look of someone who had pushed herself past all reasonable limits. But even in sleep, she maintained her gentle grip on Molly's hand, unwilling to break that connection, even for rest. Something shifted in Jackson's chest as he watched them. The woman who had come to them broken and afraid, now pouring her whole heart into saving his daughter's life. This wasn't duty or obligation. This was love, pure and fierce and absolutely unshakable. He retreated quietly to his study, sat down at his oak desk, and reached for paper and pen. His hand trembled as he wrote, the words coming straight from some deep place he'd kept locked away since Sarah's death. "Eliza," he began, then stopped, staring at her name on the paper. "How did you tell someone that they had become the center of your world without even trying? How did you explain that somewhere between the livestock market and this moment, she had stopped being the woman he'd rescued and become the woman he couldn't imagine living without?" He tried again. It was never Clara. It was always the woman who came in chains and brought us back to life. He signed it simply J and folded the letter carefully, placing it beneath the inkwell on his desk, where she would see it when she finally emerged from that sick room. Then he sat back in his chair and waited for dawn. The fever broke just as the sun crested the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Molly's eyes fluttered open, clear and bright for the first time in days, and she looked up at Eliza with a smile that could have powered the entire territory. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice hoarse but wonderfully normal. "Always," Eliza whispered back, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. "I'll always stay." That afternoon, Clara packed her bags with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to making graceful exits. She didn't cry or argue or make scenes. As her carriage was loaded, she approached Jackson one final time. "She loves you more than I ever could," she said quietly, her gloved hands folded properly at her waist. "That scares you, doesn't it?" Jackson met her gaze but didn't answer. Clara nodded as if he had spoken anyway. "I hope you're brave enough to let her." Then she climbed into her carriage and disappeared down the dusty road, taking with her all the possibilities of a different kind of life, one built on social convention rather than the messy, complicated, absolutely essential business of love. The lavender fields were almost ready for their second harvest when Eliza finally found the letter. She'd have been cleaning Jackson's study, dusting books and organizing papers, when she lifted the inkwell and saw her name written in his careful script. Her hand shook as she unfolded the paper and read the words that changed everything. She found him in the barn, checking on a mare that was due to foal any day. He looked up when she entered, and she saw something in his face she had never quite noticed before: vulnerability, hope, and a love so deep it took her breath away. "I found your letter," she said simply. He nodded, suddenly looking younger despite the gray threading his temples. "I meant every word." She crossed the space between them slowly, the letter still clutched in her hands. "I was going to leave," she admitted. "I thought Clara could give you things I never could. Clara could give me a certain kind of life," Jackson said, reaching out to touch her face with calloused fingers that trembled slightly. "But you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. You gave me a family. You gave me hope. You gave me love worth fighting for." Standing there in the golden afternoon light streaming through the barn doors, surrounded by the scents of hay and horses and home, Eliza Cole finally understood that she was exactly where she belonged. Not because someone had bought her or saved her or given her shelter, but because she had chosen to stay and they had chosen to love her back. "I love you too," she whispered, and felt the last chains fall away from around her heart. Part 8. Home at last. Snow had dusted the distant peaks, but not yet touched the Arizona desert when winter made its presence known in other ways. The mornings carried a sharp bite that sent everyone reaching for heavy coats, and the evenings drew close around the ranch house like a familiar embrace. Inside, the air smelled of pine logs burning in the hearth and the cinnamon cookies Eliza had been teaching Molly to make. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Eliza felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was home, built not from wood and stone, but from the thousand small acts of love that filled their days. Molly had taken to keeping a journal, writing in careful letters about her life with Mama Eliza and Papa Jackson. She would curl up by the window most mornings, tongue poking between her teeth in concentration, recording the important events of ranch life. The day the new calf was born, the morning she helped Papa fix the fence. The afternoon, Mama Eliza taught her to braid wildflowers into chains that wouldn't bind or break. "We're a real family now," she announced one morning, looking up from her careful writing. "That's what this says right here." Eliza smiled, her heart full to overflowing. "That's exactly what we are, sweetheart." The town of Dry Creek had gradually accepted what everyone could see with their own eyes, that Eliza Cole belonged to Jackson and Molly as surely as they belonged to her. When Widow Thompson organized the territory's first Christmas market, it was Eliza who breathed life into the plans, gathering the women together to make pinecone decorations and beeswax candles, organizing the baking schedule, and stitching small lavender sachets to sell alongside the other goods. Used to be, nobody would take direction from her. Widow Thompson confided to Jackson one evening as they watched Eliza orchestrate the final preparations. "Now half the town comes to her for advice about everything from sick babies to stubborn bread dough." Jackson nodded, his eyes following Eliza across the town square as she handed Molly a basket of sweets to distribute. She moved with the confident grace of someone who knew her place in the world, and that place was right here, among these people who had learned to value her for what she brought to their lives rather than judge her for what she had survived. One crisp December afternoon, Jackson took her out to the back pasture where he'd set up targets for shooting practice. He handed her his rifle, watching as she hefted the familiar weight. "I thought you didn't want me holding weapons," she said, remembering his caution from earlier months. "That was when you were still running," he said, meeting her eyes steadily. "Now I want you to stop being afraid. This is your land too, Eliza. You have the right to defend it." She lined up the sights the way he taught her, breathed steadily, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out clean and true, sending the tin can tumbling from its post. For a moment, she stared in amazement at what she had accomplished, then burst into laughter, the free, joyful sound of someone who had finally stopped expecting the world to punish her for existing. "You're part of this land now," Jackson said, holstering his own rifle. "Time you felt like you had the power to protect what's yours." Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in the kind of peaceful quiet that only comes to places where people have learned to be grateful for what they have. The three of them sat around the dining table, Jackson, Eliza, and Molly, sharing a simple meal that felt like the richest feast imaginable. No guests complicated the evening. No grand declarations were needed. Just warmth and food and the comfortable silence of people who knew each other's hearts. After the dishes were cleared, Molly disappeared into her room and returned with a small package wrapped in a red hair ribbon. She presented it to Eliza with the ceremony of someone bestowing a great treasure. Inside was the silver necklace from Eliza's father's buried box, but now hanging beside the original pendant was a small wooden heart, roughly carved by determined child hands. Etched into the wood in Molly's careful script was a single word: Mama. Eliza's breath caught as she lifted the necklace, feeling the weight of love that had gone into this simple gift. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, pulling Molly close. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me. Now everyone will know you're my real mama," Molly said, beaming with satisfaction. "Not just the mama of my heart, but my real, true mama." Eliza fastened the necklace around her throat and looked up to find Jackson watching, them both with an expression that made her pulse quicken. They didn't need words for what passed between them in that moment. An understanding deeper than promises, older than fear, as solid as the Arizona bedrock beneath their feet. Later, after Molly had been tucked into bed with extra kisses and Christmas wishes, Jackson found Eliza on the front porch. She stood looking out over the land that had once belonged to her father, now theirs to tend and protect and pass down to the next generation. The stars above were brilliant in the clear desert air, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other with voices that spoke of wildness and freedom and the endless possibility of tomorrow. "No regrets?" Jackson asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Only one," Eliza said, leaning into the warmth of his presence. "I wish my parents could see this, could see that their little girl found her way home after all." "Maybe they can," Jackson said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Maybe they sent you exactly where you needed to be. In the morning, Eliza knew there would be chores to do and responsibilities to meet. There would be cattle to tend, and a garden to plan, and a daughter to raise with all the love and wisdom they could give her. There would be challenges and setbacks and the ordinary struggles that come with building a life worth living. But tonight, standing in the circle of Jackson's arms under the vast Arizona sky, Eliza Cole felt something she had never expected to feel again: perfect peace. She had come to this place in chains, broken and afraid and convinced she had nothing left to lose. She was staying as a wife, a mother, and the beating heart of a family that had grown around her like desert flowers after rain in a territory where love was often a luxury few could afford. 3 people had chosen each other with the fierce determination of those who understood what it meant to be truly alone. They had built something beautiful from the ashes of loss, something strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. She came in chains, but she stayed as love itself, freely given, gratefully received, and absolutely unbreakable. The story of Eliza Cole was no longer about what had been done to her, but about what she had chosen to do with the second chance she'd been given. And in the end, that made all the difference.